I always knew what I wanted to do, which was go into the real estate business. My dad was probably my biggest mentor as I reflected on thinking about my life, in that he instilled in me a lot of principles and ideas. Basic principle was constantly being that you had to understand the creation of capital rather than selling a service. When you're sleeping at night, someone's paying you rent. During the summers, I worked for an electric company as an electrician's apprentice on my father's and his partner's properties in Oakland, and learned a lot about the construction industry and how it operated. Coming to Stanford was a treat for me because I'd been to a boys' school from the 7th to the 12th grade and never been into a class with ladies. And fortunately, in July 4th, 1956, I met a young lady who was going to Stanford with me, and we dated ever since and married for 54 years. When I left Stanford, I went into the Navy for 3 years, and then came back and was going to go to business school. And I got accepted at Harvard, and was all set to go. But I had a long talk with my dad, and he said, "Are you a pupil or a student?" He said, "Well, why don't you get into business for yourself?" So I started managing properties for Bedford Butner and made a deal on West Grand Avenue they paid me $2,500, and I built a little office building for Richfield Oil Company, which they turned around and sold for $250,000. And I said, well, I can do this. In the 60s, I started doing convenience markets, and I borrowed money from my dad to support the convenience markets. I borrowed about $150,000 from him, I remember. And he said, I'll sign a note. You sign a note and I'll give you the money, but I want it back in 6 months. Well, 6 months came and I said, hey, Dad, I can't pay you back. I got this wonderful letter from him that said, Dear Peter, your mother and I won't always be around. You got to learn to be on your own. This is our notice to you to pay off the loan. So I was shocked. And I took my projects down to the Bank of America. So they loaned me the money. And I said, under one condition, there's no guarantee for my father. And they said, we don't expect it. And that's why I banked with the Bank of America for all my development life. So I would buy a site. I did 1, and then I did 3, and then I did 5. I ended up involved in about 100 units of 7-Eleven over a period of time of 10 years. I was known as the 7-Eleven King. We did a very large project in the 70s for the Clorox Company, their headquarters in the Port of Oakland Industrial Park, which we financed with the insurance company and were able to, and the regional headquarters for the Bank of America.
He, at one point in time, was probably the largest single individual borrower from Bank of America. That's how big a developer he was, and he was building stuff all over the country.
My first impression was, he's a big, gregarious, very powerful kind of guy, and you could see that he had the makings of a pretty good little real estate empire going on. After I'd worked for him for a while, he said, okay, I'm going to give you the opportunity to be a partner in one of these warehouse projects. So I had a handshake deal with Peter as a partner. I think I had a 12.5% interest in that. After the building sold, I thought that was it, and maybe I'd get a little something out of it. But a few weeks later, I got a check handed to me for $831,000, which was my full share of the value of that office building, and that was very unique. There were very few people in the industry that would have given a young guy starting out a check for $831,000.
Peter was not easily intimidated. On this particular occasion, Hoover was having their annual dinner. Elizabeth Taylor was seated next to Peter. And after they settled themselves into their seats, she looked over him and sort of raised an eyebrow and said, "Why am I sitting next to you?" Peter gave about 3 seconds delay, looked her in the eye and said, "I'm your host."
In 1986, I did my biggest project was the acquisition of Kaiser Aluminum's real estate for about $450 million. My partner, Kemper Insurance Company, loaned me the infrastructure money, and we had about $2 billion in loans outstanding. They've decided in 1992 that they wanted to get out of the real estate business like right now. So we parted our ways, and that's how I got into the REIT business. I owned about 30% of the company and decided to use that as my financial base in building a portfolio of properties. We went from $20 million in assets to about $860 million in sales.
In the time he managed the company, the overall return was 18.2% per year, compounded for 14 years. Like $1,000, 14 years later would be over $10,000. I mean, he made the stockholders very wealthy.
Whenever we'd be in competition for a tenant and he'd win, he'd send me flowers. I'd show up in the morning in the office and there's a new bouquet at the receptionist's desk. I would say, "Uh-oh, we just lost another one to Peter."
One of the great stories I love that Peter told me is that I'd asked him where he was, and he said, "I had just gotten back from the Midwest. I flew out to look at a project, and basically I thought it might be just to observe," but he said he dressed as a janitor and walked the property and talked to tenants to see if they were happy with the property. And that's a pretty amazing thing to do.
Peter and I were both involved over many years in an organization known as the Urban Land Institute. We were pioneering about 20 years ago the concept of district councils, of having an urban land activity in every major city, and since then it's gone international. And the project was failing, and Peter offered to put up $500,000 to keep it going for one more year. Behind the scenes, I don't think very many people know about that. And so they did it for one more year, and it suddenly turned around, and it was the major impetus in the growth of the Urban Land Institute over the last 20 years.
I'm a 70-year-old man with 22-year-old twins. By the time Bedford, I came to know Mr. Bedford, we'd had about 8 years of infertility, still no children, and we went for 5 more years, and the cost went up and up and up and up, and the insurance under Bedford paid it all the time, and my doctor neighbor was aghast. He said, "Insurance doesn't pay for infertility, these kind of treatments." Well, years later, I found out, not from Peter, but from the chief financial officer, that Peter had been paying that. Kind of chokes me up.
Peter has a really refined taste in art. I met Peter in the mid-'80s. He called me up and said, "I'd like you to come by and talk about doing some work for me." And the one thing I noticed was that on all the walls of his office were really amazing pieces of art, and I couldn't really even pay attention during the meeting because I was going like, "Is that a real O'Keeffe? Is that it's like the artwork was probably worth more than the building he was in at that time."
One of the things that my dad gave to me was that you have to set your life into 3 venues. You have to be able to live off your salary, or your hobbies, or your investments. My dad, in his life, he made more money in the appreciation of his gun collection than he did working for Henry Kaiser and Company. As a result of that, my wife and I had hobbies together. Our hobby is building an art collection for ourselves.
His intense interest in art carries forward into his buildings. And I think that good buildings are aesthetically pleasing, functional, and economic. And a lot of developers forget the aesthetics part. Peter doesn't.
The most significant project, I think, that had the most impact was the Napa Valley Corporate Park. And I had done the logo for it, and the logo was a grape crusher. We started talking about that truly this could be an opportunity to do a great piece of art. And to this day, that statue is actually the gateway when you come into the wine country, and no one knows that Peter Bedford is responsible for it.
Well, I've done a few things for Stanford which align with our interests. One is we've given art to the school, including Beverly Pepper sculptures, Frank Stella nightgown sculpture. And then for Hoover, I established a fund for my father on property rights. And then I've continued to do that in instilling a chair in private property rights for the Hoover Institution.
Our carillon, which is a collection of bells, came to us from Belgium. You have to have them reclad every now and again, and it was time for them. They get out of tune. Peter stepped forward and bought a big one, which means an expensive one.
Peter is an icon of real estate developers for our generation.
To really endure a long-term career and achieve success under multiple market conditions, that's rare. And to do that while at the same time caring about your shareholders and your employees and your friends professionally that are around you, that's something really special.
Peter is the most generous man I know. He will give you anything. If you're Peter's friend, there's lots of laughing, lots of kidding, lots of joking, and he has your back.
Peter is a wise man. He's a man that's interested in other people. He has become, in many ways, my counselor for 25 plus years.
Well, I think the one thing I'd like to do is to find the right place for older people to live in as a development over time, which would combine the beauty of a project that included art, included a lot of the things that Kirsten and I have experienced together. I think I'd like to try my hand at putting a community together like that. It's going to be in Napa, in the vineyards. Be fun.